Hello, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to MDRC's College Promise Success Initiative, second open access webinar using behavioral science to improve student outreach. This webinar is brought to you by MDRC's College Promise Success Initiative, which launched earlier this year in March as a joint effort between the College Promise Campaign and the State Higher Education Executive Officers SHIO Association, and funded by the Great Lakes Corporation. This webinar today will be presented by MDRC Center for Applied Behavioral staff, Andrea Vasquez and Xavier Alemany, and moderated by me, Rosario Torres. CPSI currently provides technical assistance to 6 Promise programs across 5 states. Through this effort, we are hosting a series of free webinars related to College Promise. So a little bit more about MDRC. We are a nonpartisan social policy organization dedicated to learning what works to improve higher education programs and social policies. We conduct large-scale, rigorous evaluations to improve outcomes for low-income college students across the nation. We also provide technical assistance to schools, programs, and organizations. So I mentioned earlier, this is our second open access webinar. In case you missed our first webinar with the Detroit Promise team, you can still access the recording and slides on our CPSI website. And of course, and in case you are wondering, this webinar will be recorded and the webinar slides will be posted on the website shortly after the presentation. And although it's a little bit further out, we are having our upcoming webinar on October 30th, and it will be on Adult Promise program, so please save the date for October 30th, 1 to 2 Eastern Time. So details will be sent more regarding this webinar and with registration details, and will be posted on our website very soon. We hope that you enjoy this presentation presented by MDRC Center for Applied Behavioral Science team. We will be highlighting some recommendations to help you improve your program's student outreach and communications, whether you work inside or outside of College Promise. These techniques could be broadly applied. You'll learn more how to apply behavioral science techniques and learn how to use a simpler framework. Our behavioral science experts will share tools and resources to help you craft intentional and responsive student messaging. Now, before we begin, we are going to cover some important housekeeping. To make sure that you experience a great webinar, we've muted all of the lines to eliminate the background noise. At the end of the presentation, if you have any additional questions, please send them to promise@mdrc.org. And at this time, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to my colleague, Xavier, who will tell you more about MDRC, how we are using behavioral science to improve social programs, especially within the higher education context. You'll learn valuable behavioral science techniques that you can apply to your own students wherever you work.
Thanks, Rosie. As Rosie mentioned, my name is Xavier. I'm a part of the Center for Applied Behavioral Science, or CABS, here at MDRC. And I just want to start by giving you all a really basic definition of behavioral science. So just so we're on the same page as we start out, behavioral science is the study of how humans actually behave in the real world. And CABS is just exactly what our name implies. We're a group here at MDRC that specializes in behavioral science, and our focus is on applying research from behavioral science to all of MDRC's work. And one of our key functions is to apply and test solutions informed by behavioral science to all of the different number of challenges that social and educational programs face. Just to give you an idea of the scope of our work, here at MDRC, there are over 20 projects that incorporate lessons from this growing body of research around behavioral science. Okay, so let's go ahead and define behavioral science in a little bit more detail. So I mentioned it's the study of how humans actually behave in the real world, but if you're not familiar with the field, you're probably still like, what exactly does that mean? Because the definition could just sound like some types of psychology or economics. And if it does sound like that to you, then you are completely on the right track. That makes sense because research into human behavior definitely comes from academic fields like economics and psychology. And behavioral science draws on these fields, but it differs a little bit in that it makes sure that it doesn't make assumptions about how a quote unquote rational person would behave or react to any situations they might find themselves in. So the field actually teaches us that decision making is not purely rational, and more traditional assumptions about humans make choices are really wrong a lot of the time. And finally, the field allows us to change how we approach problem solving because it makes sure that we're more reflective about predictable patterns of behavior. So if we can predict and anticipate how people will behave when they're exposed to certain stimuli or placed in a certain situation, then we can adjust how we present that stimuli in order to help encourage behavior that's in people's best interest. So I want to touch on 3 critical insights from the field of behavioral science that should always be kept in mind. So the first one is behavioral science prioritizes the user's perspective. In the case of college or the higher education context, the user would be students. And you might think, oh, of course we should prioritize the people we're designing systems and processes for. But really, a lot of the time, processes and procedures are developed either, A, without the user in mind, or B, alternatively, we might think about the user, but make some of those false assumptions we talked about decision making. The second insight is that actions may not always reflect intentions. So research has shown that just because someone wants to do something and has every genuine intention of doing it, that doesn't mean they'll actually follow through with that action at the end of the day. And for all of us, we can all think of probably hundreds of examples in our lives where our actions didn't really line up with our original intentions. And it's just kind of human nature because we're not perfect rational beings, we don't have perfect memory, and we don't have perfect self-control. And of course, in some cases, inaction could reflect our preferences, but it could also indicate that there are some more complexities and there are barriers that are caused by the context. And then finally, I want to mention that small changes can have large effects on outcomes. So as you'll see with some of our examples, really small changes like adding a single specific element to your outreach can have surprisingly a large impact. So on this slide, I want to demonstrate some of the differences between the traditional model of human behavior and the behavioral science model of human behavior. So traditionally, we've made assumptions about behavior that really make it seem like people first receive information, and then they fully understand and absorb that information. And then they conduct this precise cost-benefit analysis in their head. And then they conclude that analysis and then execute their final choice. So I know that each and every one of us all do each and every one of these steps, especially that the cost-benefit analysis. I know I do that with every single decision I make. Okay, so probably not. So this rational agent, that economic models of decision making, they're all based on this idea of this rational agent. Okay, so here's a more realistic and behavioral science informed perspective on decision making. So first, we receive some information, and then a bunch of stuff happens, and then we make a choice, maybe. And then hopefully we complete the action based on that choice. But that choice that we make is based on a number of factors, like are people around you when you're presented with the information? How many decisions have you already made today? Are you under a ton of stress when you get this information? How much time are you given to choose? And then did you actually make a choice, or were you just overwhelmed or distracted and ended up doing nothing? So this view of decision making applies psychology to our behavior in order to explain decision making. And it's the behavioral model that we're discussing today. Okay, in this section of the webinar, we're going to get into some concrete tips for how to design student outreach materials or improve the materials you already have that exist today. And in order to structure the conversation, we're going to use this framework that was developed by CABS called Simpler. And we're going to go through each letter of the acronym, and we're going to talk about what that letter stands for and how you can use it in student outreach. And the great thing is that these are all really practical and easy to use tips that you could take and implement right away. The Simpler framework was developed to summarize key concepts used in one of MDRC's projects called the Behavioral Interventions to Advance Self-Sufficiency, or BIAS project. And BIAS was a large-scale project funded by OPRE within the Administration for Children and Families, and it was the first of its kind to apply insights from behavioral science to human service programs. After the webinar, we'll circulate some more information about the project so you can learn more about it. It's very interesting. But it's important for me to mention right now that each of the 15 interventions in BIAS use a systematic approach called behavioral design, which is a process that includes defining a problem, diagnosing why it's happening, designing a solution based on your diagnosis, and testing to see if the solution was effective. The behavioral design process is super important because it really helps you to develop solutions that are informed by research, and so that you know that they're effective. And again, as I said, the Simpler framework was developed to summarize key concepts used in most or pretty much all of the BIAS tests, so we know that they're useful across contexts. And at MDRC, we've applied each and every one of these concepts to higher education projects specifically, so you don't have to go through this full behavioral design process to know that they're effective. In our discussion of Simpler, we're going to use examples from 2 of our higher education projects to make each concept more concrete. The first project we're going to use is the Encouraging Additional Summer Enrollment, or EASE project. And this is a study involving 10 Ohio community colleges. It really aims to increase the number of students who enroll in summer courses. And a way that the project tried to do this is by sending students a behaviorally informed messaging campaign, which included emails, it included postcards, and it included letters. And the first phase of the project, which was conducted last year, was shown to be really effective, and especially given that it didn't cost very much at all. The second project we'll use examples from is called the TextEd project. TextEd is a study involving 18 educational opportunity centers, or EOCs, that are across the country. And the project uses texting in order to improve college access among non-traditional students. So the texting intervention, which is going on right now, it aims to help the students navigate things like the FAFSA and the overall college enrollment process. And just real quick, this is an image of the Simpler framework as a whole, including definitions and examples. And I want to let you know that we'll be sharing this handout at the conclusion of the webinar, as well as this slide deck. So don't worry about trying to take notes or anything if you miss an example. So let's jump right into the S in Simpler. The S in Simpler stands for social influence. Social influence is the concept that persuasion by society or a person's peers can have an effect on people's decisions and actions. And the social influence effect is based on research in behavioral science that shows people tend to follow what they think the majority of people are doing. Here's an example of social influence in a higher education context from the EASE project, the project on trying to increase summer enrollment. As part of the behavioral messaging campaign, the EASE team sent a postcard that included testimonials from students about the benefits of taking summer courses. And generally speaking, as an aside, most testimonials really do aim to harness this social influence effect. So if you look at the first testimonial, of course, it's written in the student's voice, and the student talks about what they felt were the biggest advantages of taking summer courses, which the student says it was finishing their modern language requirement and studying with friends after class. Additionally, and it's not included here for privacy reasons, but the postcard also included the names of each student who gave the testimonial and the year of their graduating class, so that students knew these were actually real people. And it really helps to add that layer of credibility whenever you're using social influence. What's really interesting to me is that behavioral science research says we could send out a postcard with this exact same information and include all these benefits of taking summer courses, but it might not be as impactful if were it not for the social influence element. So moving on to the I in simpler, this one stands for implementation prompts. So an implementation prompt is kind of just like behavioral science's way of describing a checklist. That's an easy way to think about it. The concept is that encouraging people to plan the steps they need to take to complete a task can really help move them from intention to action. You'll see that implementation prompts are really essential and have shown to help battle that challenge we talked about of the intention-action gap. So this example of implementation prompts is from one of the emails that the EASE team sent trying to increase summer enrollment. The email did a couple of things. So I really want you to focus on one aspect of it, which is how it tried to distill the summer registration process into these 4 simple steps that students needed to take. And you think, we might all think students already know how to register. Why are we sending them this deep breakdown of the steps? But research actually shows that precisely describing the steps in as simple a way as possible can help students take action on their intentions. And one of the reasons is the less you make someone think about what they need to do, the easier it is to get them to do it. Okay, so the M in simpler stands for make deadlines. The concept of including deadlines in essentially everything you ask them to do is based on the idea that framing a future action is important and also urgent by setting a due date really discourages our human tendency to prioritize today's needs over tomorrow's needs. We're all a little present bias, and instinctively we do want to prioritize our immediate needs. Like we really want to satisfy the here and now. And that seems like a sort of obvious concept, but if you think about this, think about whether you've ever made a request of a student or even a colleague, without providing a deadline. Have you ever sent an email to a colleague asking them to help you with something and didn't say by when? It's really easy to forget to provide a deadline. But deadlines are so ubiquitous in the behavioral literature and throughout all of our behavioral projects that we really can't overstate their importance. And this example that you see on the screen from the TextEd project, the team sent this text message that reminded EOC participants of the deadline to complete their college application. And one interesting way you could use deadlines in some cases is by setting a deadline, like a few days earlier than whatever the actual hard cutoff date is. And that way, students will have the opportunity to complete a task. And even if they miss that indicated deadline, they still have a little bit of wiggle room to accomplish it. And with that, I will hand it over to my colleague Andrea to take you through the rest of the simpler framework.
Thank you so much, Xavier. Hey everybody, this is Andrea. And next up on our framework is the P, which stands for personalization. So personalization is an element of this framework that reminds us that making information feel very personalized can help us guide people through difficult tasks that could improve their outcomes. So we'll take a look here at another example. This one is from EASE, the project seeking to improve summer enrollment. So this is an email communication that would have gone out to a participant of the study about their Pell Grant. So let's take a look here. The message reads, "Dear Camille, I took some time to review your financial aid package and want to make sure you know that you have grants available for summer courses. Based on my review, you have up to $2,908 from your Pell Grant, which you do not have to pay back, that you can use for summer courses." So a lot of really great things going on in this message. The first thing to notice in the email is the use of the student's first name. This kind of personalization has become such a common practice in the marketing industry that not including a student's name on your communications material could actually make it so that your message is entirely overlooked. We've all probably seen it done in our personal lives, you know, the spam emails or the ads in your mail that have your name right at the top or in the envelope. So we see it so much that we now expect it. This is a really easy piece to include in all of your communications to make sure that you're playing up this personalization piece and giving your communications the best chance of being noticed. Okay, the next thing that we'll notice on this email is what's going on here, mentioning that the counselor reviewed Camille's specific financial aid package and including her Pell Grant amount is going to make Camille feel like the message was actually genuinely crafted just for her. So this is a different but really thoughtful use of personalization and is actually going to work much better than if you said something like, you could have up to $4,000 from your Pell Grant to use for summer courses. This really specific number that isn't rounded up, the 2,908, is going to make this feel more personalized, which means our message is going to work better. Next on our framework is the L, which stands for loss aversion. And loss aversion refers to the idea that we as humans prefer avoiding losses to achieve equalized gains relative to a reference point. So in other words, we tend to dislike losses a lot more than we like gains. So framing the same opportunity as a loss to a student can actually drive behavior more strongly than framing it as a gain. And now we'll take a look at an example from our text ed study, which is the study seeking to improve college access among non-traditional students. And this is a message that is going out about financial aid. So let's take a look here on the screen. The message reads, Lisa, financial aid is available to help you pay for school. You may qualify for tuition assistance in cash in grant aid, money you don't pay back. Applying for aid can take time. The more you get organized now, the easier it will be. Don't leave money on the table. And it's that last phrase, don't leave money on the table, that frames the financial aid money that Lisa stands to gain if she applies for financial aid as money that she sort of already has and stands to lose. Our work and what others in the field have learned about this really interesting concept of loss aversion tells us that saying something like, don't leave money on the table is more likely to lead to action than saying something like, you could earn up to $6,000 from the Pell Grant. So another really interesting and easy strategy to take with you and use in all of your communication. Okay, next on our framework is the E, which stands for ease. So we all know that getting students to do things like fill out their financial aid applications, enroll in classes early, and visit their academic advisors can be an uphill battle. And if we think about our personal lives, we can all probably think of a time when we, despite our best intentions, as Xavier was mentioning before, we failed to do something that we knew would be good for us, like hitting the gym after work or taking our car for an oil change. We had every intention of doing things and then for one reason or another ended up not following through. And of course, the reasons why students may fail to follow through could vary widely. And the ease concept in our simpler framework here is reminding us to be thoughtful, not to put any additional barriers to action for our students, and make sure that we are removing complexity whenever we have the chance. So basically, the easier an action seems to a student, the more likely it is that they're going to follow through. All right, let's take a look at another example from the EASE project about summer enrollment. So this is another message here, and instead of sending a student a reminder about enrolling in summer classes, this EASE message is giving the student something super clear and pretty actionable to follow up on. The message reads, I took some time to run a degree audit for you. According to blank system, you are a business management major. Here are a few courses you still need for your degree that are offered this summer, and then there's a list of 3 courses with the name of the course and the code of the course, making this super simple. So although sending a link to the class catalog would probably lead the students to the same information that you're providing in this email here, and although that might seem like an easier and faster thing to do, pulling the specific courses along with their codes and names, like you see here, is going to make it a lot easier for the student to act on the information that you're providing. So the more that you can do to help your students feel like the steps to success are clear and easy for them to follow, the more likely that they're going to be to follow through. And last but not least on our simpler framework is the R for reminders. So we've all probably experienced the wonders of setting reminders for ourselves in our daily lives. They can be really useful because they essentially reduce the amount of mental effort that we have to put in to remember to do a task by providing a cue that a specific task still needs to be completed. So a good thing to do, I think, is to always assume that when you are trying to get any of your students to do anything by a given deadline, they're likely going to be thinking about a ton of other things and trying to get a ton of other things done at the very same time that you are sending them the information with a deadline. So smart and frequent reminders are going to be of huge help to them. Let's take again a look at an example from our EASE project, the EASE project aiming to increase summer enrollment. So to encourage students to enroll in summer courses, the project team could have sent an email on the first day of the month reminding students about the registration deadline on the 30th, and then hung back and checked how many students registered after the deadline had passed. This, of course, would have made it really difficult for students to hold the date in their minds for 4 long weeks and not forget to actually register on the 30th. So instead, a best practice here and what the team did is they sent the initial email at the beginning of the month, followed by a letter 2 weeks later, then a postcard a week before the deadline, and lastly, an email 2 days before the deadline. So sending frequent reminders in varying formats is a really helpful way to honor the fact that students may miss deadlines not because they don't care about them, but because they have a lot of other things going on in their lives and they may need help remembering what they should be prioritizing for school and when. And that takes us to the end of our framework, and I'll hand it back over to Rosie.
Thank you, everyone, for joining, and thank you to both of our presenters, Andrea and Xavier. We hope that you found this webinar informative and useful to your students and your own program needs. Please look out for a follow-up email with the slides from today. It will have attached the simpler framework handout. And then also want to point your attention to some further readings. Today, MDRC released the EASE brief, Making Summer Pay Off. You may want, if that is of interest, that is available. But to learn more about the studies referenced during this presentation, please visit our website for more information. And stay tuned for more upcoming webinars. Thank you so much.